thank you to, I think, Nimi, who's been, I actually set my slides on time for later today, which is an amazing sort of feat. So Nimi's sort of persistent and careful organization of this event, but also to Sophie and Malini. We've been wanting, to kind of reach out across at least Sydney, and I think we've actually brought in Canberra today as well through Carly's presence, and really sort of do an event where a lot of our students but also a number of our staff actually come together and collaborate. So I think, as Sophie mentioned, and Malini has asked me to kind of tell you a little bit about the Institute and also Western Sydney. So first of all, just welcome to Western Sydney University. I know for those of you probably coming from the University of Sydney and elsewhere, it sort of seems really, really far away, even though it's about a 20-minute train ride. And certainly when I worked at University of Sydney, Western Sydney felt far, but actually we're quite connected, and I think increasingly connected in terms of the kind of work that we're doing. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the Institute for Culture and Society, we were established in 2012 by distinguished Professor Ian Eng, Professor Paul James, who will be moving in and out of here, was our second director for about 5 years, and then I've joined in 2020, about a month before the pandemic. And so these kinds of events, what we had imagined that we might be doing more of and connecting across the city, became virtual, became quite difficult for a number of years, so we're really delighted to have it back. The Institute itself, it is filled with a range of very interdisciplinary researchers. The first kind of the origins of it were really in cultural studies, and I think particularly that was a kind of global phenomenon, but I think Australian cultural studies has always globally been seen as a kind of cutting edge of the field, bringing together anthropologists, media and communication scholars, geographers, sociologists, political scientists, a range of we have people who do make films, and other sorts of kind of humanities and social sciences disciplines, but also education, business, and so on. So what you will probably be hearing here kind of reflects more of the kind of interdisciplinary nature of our institute, at least from our side. And I think with Malini at the helm and me and a number of other people, you'll hear probably a bit more anthropology than maybe has always been present at the Institute. We've been hiding behind the scenes for a number of years. So it's, but I think certainly, and you'll hear a bit more later today, so I won't go on, but I think also it will see, I feel like my work is that much better because I have been able to step outside of anthropology, take my anthropology training, but also, really be in dialogue in a meaningful way with colleagues like Dennis, who's, an archaeologist by training and also looks at material culture, but in a different kind of way. And so that's, I think, what I hope the kind of Institute and Culture Society sort of space provides you with an opportunity to kind of think outside of the parameters of disciplines. You have to think with disciplines, but I think moving across is something that we're really excited that will happen today, and certainly has been carefully programmed into the curated into the program today. So I think with that, I might end on the notes, but just to welcome you, feel free to touch base, ask more questions, feel free to suggest other events, feel free to be critical. All of us, I think, who have been doing this work for a long time, we're not using the same methods that we started with. We failed, we've tripped up, we've done it wrong, we would do things differently in other ways. So I think, please come with that kind of spirit of really kind of working at how this kind of set of conversations will help your own kind of thinking about what you're doing and how you're doing it. Because always, I've never had a methodology that has stayed the same from the beginning of a project to the end of the project. So I really, really welcome and encourage you to, to engage in that sort of way. So yes, I think from there I might turn it back to you, Sophie.
Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to think methods with all of you. I also want to start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Darug people, and that some of what follows was written on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded, and also to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge that we meet at a time of unthinkable violence in Gaza. 9 months into violence on a scale that's hard to comprehend. 9 months of witnessing day in, day out, not just the slaughter of thousands of people, but also what we've come to recognize as scholasticide. The killing of so many Palestinian students, teachers, professors, and the targeted destruction of Gaza's schools, universities, libraries, and museums. So this is the moment in which we meet at this university to talk about, as the organisers put it, methods in the contemporary world. What is this contemporary world, and how do we respond to it, engage it through our methods? I'm not sure we can think about this question today without keeping Gaza in view, keeping it present in one way or another. So I'm not going to talk about Gaza specifically, but I will be talking about the present and its place in our work. And in a way, this is a response to the prompt from Sophie and Melanie that asked Randy and I to talk about stories from fieldwork. So there are obviously different ways of responding to this prompt. I could talk about stories about my fieldwork, those sometimes stressful, emotionally complex, often awkward and funny anecdotes that are so much of the stuff that brings anthropologists together in spaces like this, in seminars, but also at the pub. Stories that also account for such a large part of anthropology's self-mythologizing. Edmund Leach losing his field notes in the chaos of war in highland Burma, Clifford Geertz caught up in that police raid in Bali. I could talk also about how collecting stories was so much a part of my fieldwork, as it is with most, if not all, of us. Stories about lives, relationships, events, histories, memories, triumphs, and tragedies. I could talk about the complex responsibilities we take on as we listen to those stories, jot them down, write them up, read and teach them. But what I really want to focus on instead today is the question of where our stories start, and especially where they end. I want to focus on this question because I think it draws into view a set of methodological issues emerging from a long-standing area of anthropological concern that I gestured to just before, and is the problem of the ethnographic present. Before I do that, I want to explain why it is that these are the methodological issues that are calling my attention. Part of this has to do with Gaza, but it also has to do with the book I'm now finishing, or at least attempting to finish. And this is a book, in short, about a time that has passed. It's based on fieldwork I did in Myanmar during the country's so-called democratic transition, that roughly 10-year window between around 2011 and a military coup in 2021. During this period, there was a sense, a story maybe, that Myanmar was being saved. And this is what my dissertation and now my book is more or less about. So this transition was drawing an end to 50 years of military rule. Aung San Suu Kyi, the famous democracy leader, was freed, as were hundreds of political prisoners. One of the world's harshest censorship regimes was eased. The economy was liberalised. Western countries normalised relations, ending sanctions and massively increasing aid. Tourists, investors and NGOs all flooded in, along with a handful of anthropologists. So much of my research focused on the country's small community of Pentecostal Christians, for whom the country's salvation meant something else, something more. Not only was God bringing Myanmar from dictatorship to democracy, he was also bringing its population, about 90% Buddhist, to Christ, or so the story went. And to this end, believers had an important role to play. Entering a public sphere emerging from decades of censorship and surveillance, they took to street corners, to buses and to trains, to parks in the shadow of glistening Buddhist pagodas, preaching the gospel more loudly than was conceivable under the old regime. Again, or at least that was the story. As these believers worked with God to secure Myanmar's salvation, to bring on this rupture with the country's dark past, evidence mounted that that break might still be some way off. The transition, as we all now know, was a time of contradiction, one marked by a crony class consolidating its hold on the nation's wealth and a rising tide of Buddhist nationalism that menaced minorities and then played out most horrifically in the Rohingya genocide. There were also a few signs 2 centuries on from the first arrival of foreign missionaries that Buddhists were suddenly interested in Jesus. So this book that I'm now finishing or attempting to finish is a book that attempts to dwell in these contradictions or in these gaps. It's about the dissonance of salvation. Salvation as a promise, as a project, and as a problem. And it's about how living through a quickening moment when you are being told that everything is changing is also living through a time when plainly much is staying the same. So how to attune to these dissonances became a methodological question during fieldwork, which voices to listen to, through which spaces to follow their reverberations, in which technologies to locate their amplification, across which networks to trace their resounding. But there's also a sense in which the bigger methodological questions, for me at least, have arisen in and through the process of writing first the dissertation and now the book. So there's a really obvious and familiar point here about the increasing recognition of what is, or perhaps should be, a blurred distinction between field and desk, a point perhaps about the increasing patchwork nature of our fieldwork and the digital connections that tether us to field sites long after formal periods of fieldwork are done, dissertations submitted, funding ended, articles published. Indeed, thinking about stories, about their beginnings and their endings, reminds us of the difficulty of disentangling what gets called method from what gets called writing, of the way in which the relationship between those two tasks is, of course, messy. Now, I said before that my book is about a time that has passed. The same could, of course, be said of any piece of ethnographic writing, and a lot has been written about the ethical and epistemological issues of this, or implications of this temporal dissonance for the doing of anthropology in particular, and I'll turn to those issues in a moment. Still, I think the direction things have gone in Myanmar since my fieldwork and the speed with which they have done so has been extreme. So even before the coup, though, as I was writing up my dissertation, the story of Myanmar's democratization was starting to fray. The dissonances were growing louder, and for all of the reasons that I mentioned before. Even so, the coup on the 1st of February 2021 still came as a shock. And I remember the flurry of messages and the cascade of Facebook posts. It was nighttime in London, early morning in Yangon, and pray for us was a common refrain. Like others, I watched as the protests grew. Health workers and teachers the first to go on strike, garment factory workers following soon after. Each evening in Yangon, people were taken to balconies and street corners to bang pots and pans, driving away in a cacophonous wave the evil of the coup. By the middle of February, tens of thousands of protesters were assembling each day across Yangon at busy intersections and parks that I knew well from my fieldwork. My Christian friends were among them. We stayed in touch via Facebook and increasingly via the more secure and encrypted Signal. They sent selfies of themselves amid the swelling crowds, holding placards or fingers raised in the three-finger Hunger Games salute, singing protest songs borrowed from the country's 1988 uprising. In the 3 years since, Myanmar's revolution has continued to evolve. As with Gaza, there are daily reports of horrific violence as the military desperately tries to hold on to power. Thousands of civilians have been massacred. A growing number of young people leave cities to join small armed groups fighting to overthrow the junta, often alongside ethnic armies who control much of the country's borderlands. Watching all this unfold from afar, I've asked, is this part of the same story as the one I'm trying to write, albeit a sharp turn? Or did that story end on the 1st of February 2021, and is this a new one? These questions return us to a classic anthropological problem, the problem of the ethnographic present. So I'm pleased to hear from Heather that we're kind of heavy on anthropologists, I guess, in the room. But still, let me talk about this a little. This problem of the ethnographic present is a problem that we grappled with decades ago. We're familiar with the critiques of early anthropologists whose ethnographies tended to suspend people in an unchanging present outside of time entirely. The social anthropologist normally studies the population of a particular place at a particular point in time, Edmund Leach wrote in Political Systems of Highland Burma. The authors write as if the Trobrianders, the Tikopia, the Nua are as they are now and forever. So you'd be hard-pressed today, I'm sure, to find anthropologists whose writing denies the coevalness with the people they study in the manner Johannes Fabian and others so influentially critiqued quite a long time ago now. What's more, even as our methodological conventions continue to position the present as anthropology's hallmark temporal domain, what Joel Robbins calls our thick temporal middle, we increasingly venture beyond it, backwards through archives of history, memory, and genealogy, and forwards along trajectories of aspiration, hope, and speculation. It's a mistake, though, I think, to believe that the problem of the ethnographic present has somehow gone away. Mine might be an extreme case, but we can all, of course, tell versions of this story. Our relationship to the present is something that confronts anyone who does fieldwork. And this might be because the methods associated with it, still grounded in some version of being there, even if increasingly mediated in complex and patchwork ways, allow us, or so the story goes, to share a present with the people about whom we write. At the same time, though, we're forced to confront, often directly and painfully, the fragility of that shared space-time, the way it crumbles as we leave our field sites, recedes as we start to draft a dissertation chapter or an article, and all this notwithstanding the digital connections that remain. It's not just our methodological conventions that tie us to some image of the present. There are also the presentist impulses driven by the demands that our work has impact and relevance in the here and now, for better and for worse. None of this emerges in a vacuum. As Laurent Berland writes, discussions about the contours and contents of the shared historical present are always profoundly political ones. We understand nothing about the impasses of the political, Berland continues, without having an account of the production of the present. What would such an account look like for anthropology today, and what might be gained from approaching this question from the perspective of methods? I don't have a good answer this morning, but what I will do is make a plug for a collection that I recently edited with Nikita Simpson and Tim Cooper, where we start to sketch out some of these possibilities. One thing that emerges from this exchange, and which is relevant to today's conversation, has to do with something unspoken that often rests beneath a lot of writing and thinking on methods. and that is the connection between the present and presence. The latter increasingly held up not just as a methodological commitment, but also as some kind of ethical virtue. But the etymological and semantic link between the present and presence seems, in fact, to be an idiosyncrasy of certain languages, including English. In Urdu, and I take this example from my co-editor Tim, the word or a word for the present, or hal, emanates from an Arabic root that also offers terms for moods, attitudes, and processes of transformation. In spaces of Islamic mysticism, hal can describe states of ecstasy achieved in the pursuit of love or of divinity. So we became interested in thinking about what happens if, led by our interlocutors and inspired by such different connotative possibilities, we were to think anew about the relationship between the present and presence. How might that also transform how we think about urgency, immediacy, responsibility, hesitancy, solidarity, and what we mean by the contemporary world and the responsibilities we have towards it? How might doing so open up methodological possibilities for new forms of anthropological witnessing that, in Liana Chua's words, don't centre the anthropologist and her testimony and attend to the processes and conditions of witnessing, as well as the spaces between witnesses, witnessing, and testimonial forms. To be a witness can be to tell a story. Right. It's also what my friends in Myanmar were so actively doing in the years of the country's apparent transition. To witness, in Christian parlance, is to share the ways in which Jesus has transformed your life and can change the world. It is to tell stories about the promise of salvation. In the months that followed Myanmar's coup, my Christian friends' posts filled my Facebook feed. Selfies in COVID-19 face masks amid the swelling crowds, memes mocking the generals, advice for fellow protesters on what to do in the event of tear gas, photographs of bloody bodies wounded by security forces. As the military's crackdown became increasingly brutal, posts started to show my friends wearing not just face masks, but also helmets and goggles. During those first few weeks of protest, some friends, as I learnt via Facebook, spent a lot of time on the small minibus that the church owned, taking it for drives across Yangon and praying for the crowds of protesters that they passed on their journey. One collective prayer, streamed via Facebook Live, was put to the rhythm of a familiar call and response chant made famous in the '88 uprising, but replaced the usual rejoinder, Doye, Doye, or our cause, with Amen, Amen. In other videos, members of this mobile prayer team sang Kabana Chebu, a protest anthem, also from '88, then being reprised at protest sites across the city. Its melody is borrowed from the 1977 progressive rock hit Dust in the Wind by Kansas, and it starts with the line, "We will keep fighting until the end of the world." The end of the world. In many ways, the Pentecostals I came to know were already dwelling in the shadow of the world's imminent demise, reading the news for signs that they might be living in the last days. Christianity, of course, has its own beginnings and endings, its own stories about the world whose narrative arcs sit, sometimes neatly, but often pretty awkwardly with others, including the arcs of a democratic transition or of a dissertation project. In any case, the revolution that continues to unfold in Myanmar seems to have entailed the transformation of people and politics on a scale entirely different from the transition that I studied during my fieldwork. And I'm still not exactly sure how to respond to this as a writing. What I do know is that where previous drafts of my book were written in the present tense, I'm now writing my final drafts mostly in the past tense. And to finish writing it now and to read it in some future present is to dwell amid the dissonance of knowing from the outset how the story ends, or at least a certain version of it. So to wrap up, to think about stories about fieldwork is also, I think, to think about their beginnings and their endings. Again, today's workshop is, as the organisers have put it, an opportunity to reflect on methods in the contemporary world. I'm grateful for the chance to think with everyone about the first part of that phrase, to mess with methods, but I think that doing so might entail thinking about the methodological implications of the second part, the contemporary world. The contemporary referring not just to that which lives in the present, but also to the state of living at the same time as something else, from near or far. Doing so might involve not only exploring what we mean by the contemporary world and what kinds of presence it asks of us, it might also involve thinking about what it means methodologically to do research and to write, while in Myanmar, Gaza, other places we meet through our screens, there are worlds that are being destroyed and worlds perhaps that are being born. Thanks very much.